So good morning, and in this session we will cover the APS research methodology. My name is Dr. Jesvir Kaur Mahil, and the APS research methodology is the way I construct research to base as the foundational fieldwork for the research that goes into the books that I've published. For example, the most recent book that I published using this methodology, this was the third in the series of similar books that I've published. This is called Learn to Lead, using stories, synthesis and questions. And in this session, I will go through the rationale, the underpinning assumptions that went into the approach that I took. APS stands for Autoethnography, Public Engagement and Self-Publishing. And this is because I make sure that I'm using several perspectives in the research approach. Autoethnography provides the first-person perspective, the lived experience. Public engagement through discourse, through conversations, through discussions, provides a second-person we perspective to the research. And the publishing aspect provides the third-person consulting literature that already exists and presenting my own as a contribution to what already exists. So that's in the public domain. That's more impartial. So we've got these different, when I'm engaged in my writing, I'm thinking about what do I know about this? What do we know about it? And I use the dialogues and the conversations, etc., to get a sense of what the discourse about the subject is. And the third person is what is already known. What do people who are experts in this area think about it? And what can I contribute to that? So when we start research, it needs to be systematic. And this is the underpinning assumptions for the scientific method, is that our approach to research needs to be systematic, it needs to be logical, it needs to be transparent, and above all, it needs to be ethical. So we usually start with an observation, and we are curious about something, we notice something, we realize that there is something that we don't know about a particular interest of ours, and we formulate questions about it. We wonder why. We may form some assumptions about it, thinking about, well, maybe this happens because of that, but those are our assumptions. And we do this from childhood. From childhood, we're asking questions to our family or our friends, and we form hypotheses. And our methodology in those cases, in the informal kind of research that we do to find solutions to the problems that we have, is simply asking the questions, having conversations. And we may later on in life, when we've got questions that people can't necessarily answer in a simple manner, we may go about collecting data. And that data might be from books that we've read, the data might be from documentaries. And this is what makes I would say, the difference between formal research and informal research, because with formal research, that process of analysis needs to be robust, it needs to be rigorous. Whereas informally, we might form these hypotheses and we have our assumptions, but we don't necessarily sit down and reflect on our assumptions and wonder, well, are these false assumptions that we've been holding for all these years, or is there, are they credible? And so with the analysis, so remember that the scientific method, there needs to be transparency. So it needs to be very transparent what data we've collected, where we've collected the data from, and how we've analysed it, and how that there's an alignment between our findings and our analysis of the data. And then we draw conclusions, and of course the conclusions need to link up with our methodology, the way we've collected the data, the findings that we have, and then the recommendations. And then the dissemination of knowledge is another thing that makes, that differentiates research which is formal and research which is informal, which we do in our everyday lives anyway. And that dissemination of knowledge can come through writing articles, writing reports, speaking at conferences, sharing knowledge with peers either in academia or in our organizations. So we disseminate the knowledge, and and every one of us does this in our professional lives. We always have to, at meetings, for example, we may need to present a case for doing one thing versus another thing, and so that dissemination of knowledge is a key factor in the scientific method. So I suppose the main things to remember about it is like, is the way that we're doing research, is it systematic? Is there a logical kind of coherence to it? Is it transparent? If somebody else was to look at our data sources and the way we've analyzed it, would they come to the same conclusions? And if not, why not? And is it ethical? The ethics is really important. Have we used deception in our methodology? And if we've used deception, who does that harm? And is are the benefits of using deception, or do they outweigh the risks or the damage that's been caused? So when we are using the scientific method, as we said, it begins first of all with an observation, with a curiosity. We may feel there's a need. We need to know something, and no one is providing us with the answers to this thing that we need. And we're motivated through our internal drivers and also sometimes external drivers. There are problems that we don't have, but other people have, and we feel motivated to resolve an issue for them. And that leads to the question, the hypothesis, and the methodology is our approach to finding the answers, to the solutions, to the insights. And within that methodology, we may have various methods. So the methodology is the actual approach. What approach are we going to use? And the methods, for example, the method could be, I don't do this, but other people who are doing research, they might design a survey, they might design a questionnaire, they might design an experiment. So those are the methods that I don't use. The reason I don't use those is because I use a qualitative approach rather than a quantitative. I like my research to be in a natural environment rather than a constructed environment. So experiments are artificial environments. I don't really value surveys and questionnaires that much. And so methodologies like how are we actually going to find the answers to those questions? And I use conversations, discourse, discussions, conferences, and the data collection, the analysis, that could, in my case, so I will keep referring back to the way I do the research. So for Learn to Lead, I asked people to share stories, to share their facts about various things, their opinions, and I could have used statistics, but I didn't. The statistics, that's more of a quantitative approach when we're more interested in facts rather than opinions. I use themes, look for themes in what people are saying, identify the patterns, what the trends are, what the correlations are. So again, like correlations is more to do with the statistics. And with my research, I tend to use the themes and the patterns. What insights can I gain by joining the dots between various facts that people have said, and what are the gaps as well in that data as well. So with the findings, very often the findings can lead to new questions, and there can be an emergence of insights. And for me, learning needs to take place in the findings. And if no learning has taken place, I would doubt whether actually I need to dig deeper. So I keep on digging deeper until I feel that learning has taken place for myself and through my public engagement as well. And very often my findings are a catalyst for new discourse. So that's the emergence of new questions, new insights, and new things that we may not have been curious about at the start, but we become curious during that. So all of that is what we find through doing that analysis on the data. And then our conclusions. And so through our data analysis, we have identified these patterns and these trends, and then we synthesize, we put it together, we put the jigsaw puzzle back together and think, well, what's the picture that we've created, putting all these different elements together? And then the recommendations can lead to influencing others, with those new insights. What's the influence and what's the impact of it? And the dissemination of knowledge, as I said earlier, can occur through writing reports, books, conferences, or through social media. So why do I use the APS approach, autoethnography, public engagement, and self-publishing? The rationale for using this is that autoethnography, being based on our lived experience, we are all experts on our own lived experience. We are experts. No one can deny that we're not experts on our own experience. And this fact empowers those who may feel that they are silenced or marginalized or overlooked or underrepresented in various situations. And so within situations where we may feel that we don't, in terms of the cultural hegemony, there's a dominant culture, and we are not part of that dominant culture. We're part of a culture which is maybe on the margins, maybe it's a smaller culture than the dominant culture, but for whatever reason, whether it's to do with size, whether it's to do with positioning, for some reason, we feel that our voice is not being heard. And so autoethnography, being based on our own lived experience, is a powerful way to influence and to make an impact. A recent example of this is the case of the post office and the sub-postmasters. Each of those sub-postmasters, they have their lived experience of what they suffered during those, those tragic periods. And so their lived experience is, they are experts on their own lived experience. And with reflection on that experience, it can be powerful for others. And so this is where, with autoethnography, we have to be careful that we're not using autoethnography as a rant. So we can't be in that state where we are totally kind of engrossed in our frustration or anger or sadness or whatever it is that we're experiencing. We have to be removed from it enough that we can reflect on it for it to be useful, because a rant is not really going to be of use to others. It might be cathartic for the person who's experiencing that at that time, but for others there needs to be some sort of distance. And I think this is why Alan Bates, in that example of the sub-postmasters, Alan Bates, it appears to me when I watched the drama, he was removed enough from the situation that he wasn't totally overwhelmed by it, and that made his lived experience a catalyst for others to be empowered by, because he was reflective enough. He didn't lose his power to that. He was still empowered to take action. And public engagement, researching, so this is again looking at the example of Alan Bates. He did his public engagement, and he was researching with the other postmasters. When I wrote my book Learn to Lead, I was researching with others, rather than placing myself as an expert or an outsider who was researching about the community. I wasn't researching about my community, I was researching with my community. And there's an element of reciprocity, the co-creation of knowledge for community emancipation. This is what I did in my previous book, Sikhs of Stafford. That book, the fact that book is written and it records the work that the elders have done to create the Gurdwara in Stafford since the 1960s, how they went about that, the fact that that is recorded and there's a book and they have their photographs in the book, that record elevates them. It kind of immortalizes them. It immortalizes them. And so that's the purpose of that public engagement, is that it's not about the researcher, it's about the researcher and the community working together to create an asset, to create social and cultural capital, which is for the benefit of both, rather than the researcher extracting information and then going away with that information and, never seeing that community again. So this is where a blend of that autoethnography and the public is, I find that to be very powerful. And why self-publishing? Well, self-publishing, it requires accountability, total accountability for what we publish, ownership of being responsible for what we publish, and it provides us with the agency to speak truth to power. So this is particularly in cultures where there is a dominant culture and non-dominant cultures where there's cultural hegemony. So we can bypass the gatekeepers who may be protecting the interests of the status quo. So this is self-publishing is a way of communicating our message to those we want to communicate with, without the middle person, without that gatekeeper to say, yes, that message is fine to go through, and that message, no. So we're communicating directly. And I use my Sikhi for this as well, because with Sikhi, it's like we have a direct relationship to Waheguru. We have a direct relationship. We don't need to go through a priest or another gatekeeper to have that direct communication. So it's, the underpinning kind of philosophy of this, it's like, let us speak our truth with sincerity, with honesty, to those we want to speak to, without that need for a gatekeeper to distort or manipulate or, to authorize our message. So these are the underpinning assumptions or rationale behind this approach, the APS, where there are 3 pillars. And then, so the scientific approach to APS. So we said that with the scientific approach, the approach needs to be systematic, it needs to be logical, there needs to be transparency, and it needs to be ethical. So whenever we're doing research, we need to consider the ontology, epistemology, philosophy, ethics, research questions, methodology, findings, conclusions, the self-publishing in my case, and emergence. This is, for me, I consider emergence to be an integral part of the research, what comes out of it. Now we'll go through each of these in a bit more detail. So first of all, ontology. What do we mean by ontology? Ontology is about the nature of our being and our existence. We all have different perspectives on this. Who are we? Some people think that we, as individuals, we are separate from nature, and others will think, no, we are an integral part of nature. It's that that thing of like, if there's a bang in the forest but there's no one to hear it, does that, does that bang really exist? So is there an existence separate to us, or does it exist only because we're there to hear it? So are we apart, or are we separate? That's one of the perspectives on ontology. And earlier on I said I use a qualitative approach rather than a quantitative approach to doing research, because I believe that we are that there's a subjective reality rather than a separate reality, that whereas others may think, well, no, a forest will still be a forest even if no one sees that, it still exists. So whether we think that our reality is constructed based on who we are, or whether reality exists as a factual entity regardless of who is there to interpret it, those are different ontological perspectives. So with my approach, because I'm using a subjective qualitative approach, for me identity is really important. Our identity, the language that we speak, our values, our beliefs, our political assumptions, the environment that we're in, our social status and our position in that environment, and whether, where does our motivation come from? Why are we interested in the subject that we are focused on? So, for example, when I was writing Sikhs of Stafford, I was interested in that subject because my family were part of those who back in the 60s took leadership in creating that, and so there's that personal interest in leaving a legacy for the next generation, and the motivation came from the fact that a lot of the elders, they're in their old age, and I was motivated to recognize them, to acknowledge their contribution to it. So that's ontology. And then epistemology is about knowledge. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, what is knowledge? What do we know about that particular subject? So for example, at the moment, my subject of interest is about azadi, izzat, and the concept of home. And what do we know about it? Well, I'm thinking about azadi, izzat, and the notion of kar for those of us Sikhs who live in the diaspora. And I don't know much about what our concepts about this is, because I haven't engaged in, well, I've recently started to engage in discourse about this, but I don't know very much about it. So there has to be a gap in our knowledge. What do we know? What don't we know? And how do we know? That's really important in epistemology. How do we know what we claim to know? What are the sources? Where do we get that information from? Who decides what's knowledge and what's not knowledge in relation to the subject of interest? And so for some people, knowledge is what the experts say. Knowledge is, what the gatekeepers have allowed to be published in the journals. That is knowledge. If it hasn't been published in a journal, why not? Why has it not been published? Maybe it's not credible. Maybe it's not, it's not robust enough in terms of the research. But the question about epistemology is like, well, who has decided? Where has this data, this information that you claim supports your contribution to knowledge? Where does it come from? And what makes that knowledge credible? What makes it reliable? What makes it valid? So again, like with my current subject, I'm looking at why some people find it very difficult to reconcile the different cultures and to create harmony in their lives, bringing together the dominant culture and the community culture, etc. And I don't know what is credible, reliable, and valid knowledge about this particular specific area. And so when we doubt what we read in the newspapers, what we read in the magazines, we doubt the credibility, the reliability, because it comes from a very narrow perspective. Then we, that can create an incentive to want to do some research, to find out, to discover a different perspective on it. So that's epistemology. That's the whole thing of like, well, what is knowledge and how do we know? Who says, who distinguishes, who gives credibility, or who says that this is valid and this isn't valid? And this is one of the things that motivates me to do my research, because very often the gatekeepers for this, the gatekeepers who say this is knowledge and that's not, that's not knowledge. It's very limited and narrow, very narrow perspectives, often very Eurocentric perspectives about what is knowledge and what isn't knowledge. And so to disrupt that hegemony about the locus of control over it, it's providing another alternative. It's like, well, maybe it's broader, maybe like can we broaden the horizons about what we consider to be knowledge. And philosophy is another aspect that we need to consider. So again, I'm going to simplify and look at philosophy based on my own research, and because there are hundreds of philosophies, but we just need to look at the underlying assumptions that that are apparent in our deeply held convictions about the nature of being, the nature of existence, and the nature of reality. And so when I do research, broadly, I look at two types of philosophy. There's the Eastern type of philosophy and the Western type of philosophy. And with the Eastern philosophies, there tends to be a focus on the whole, on the collective, on the there's an assumption about fate and destiny, that various things are destined and fate, whereas with the Western approach, there's more of a focus on the free will and determinism and the individual needs and aspirations, whereas in the Eastern philosophy there's an emphasis on public sharing of knowledge, that knowledge, it doesn't have to be copyrighted, knowledge doesn't have to be trademarked because it belongs to everyone. But in the Western philosophy, there tends to be a focus on, well, who owns this knowledge? It's private ownership. If you say something that somebody else has said already, you can be accused of plagiarism because somebody else said that and you haven't acknowledge the fact that somebody else said that. Whereas with an Eastern approach, well, this is all in the public domain. We don't need to copyright and trademark turmeric because it belongs to everyone. Whereas with the Western philosophy, no, it belongs to that person who has spent all those years researching it and discovering, its healing benefits. People didn't know its healing benefits before. Now we know. So therefore, the person who did that, spent years of their life doing that, they have the right to that knowledge. And so there can be like less of a focus on transparency, whereas I prefer to share, I prefer to be transparent. But in some researchers will keep their work very private until they are ready to publish, because they don't want their work to be stolen, they don't want their ideas to be stolen. So that we have to think about what, in terms of our philosophical approach, are we going to be in alignment with that philosophical approach where we're going to make our research transparent and share it and and think about the whole, rather than are we going to guard this our discoveries, our findings, are we going to guard them until we are sure that no one else is going to steal these ideas and we've published it and we can claim private ownership of it? And another thing that I noticed, which is different in terms of the Eastern and the Western approach, on a separate note, is that there's more of a focus on elders in the Eastern approach, and so what's gone on before. So that's one of the reasons. It's like, well, this isn't entirely new because people have been saying this for thousands of years, and so there's more of a focus on respect and acknowledgement of what's gone on before, the elders, whereas with the Western approach, there tends to be a focus on the future, the children, the future, and how will this research make things better for the next generation. And so it's more forward looking rather than historical, rather than looking at the roots, trying to discover, trying to understand what's gone on before. And so again, overall, the Eastern philosophies, in my view, they tend to be more focused on harmony and interdependence, and is this research going to create systemic kind of benefit, whereas in the Western approach there's more of a focus on the independence, and is this research going to perhaps lead to more success for the individual. So so these are the this is kind of very broad brush, but for me it kind of helps me to make choices based on, well, what is my philosophy? Do I believe in privacy, or do I believe in transparency? Do I believe in sharing, or do I believe in ownership? So based on what my philosophical assumptions are, what my my character, what does it align with? And of course there's a time and space for both. In some cases, when someone has spent 6 years of their life researching something, they do have the right to be published and to be known to be the person who's dedicated all those years and to make those discoveries. But that's not me. For me, it's about sharing it. So it's a different approach, and so the flavor of the research will be different because it's done openly rather than behind closed doors. And so ethics is basically the principle of do no harm, and we need to make sure that anyone who's contributing or participating in our research knows why we're doing it. They need to know what the benefits of the research are. They need to know who's funding the research, what the risks may be, why we're doing that research, what is our purpose. And there needs to be the values of fairness and justice and other ethical values, because if the research is not really going to improve fairness or justice and things like that, then the ethical question would be, well, is it worth spending that time and that energy in engaging in research that's not going to improve things in terms of our values in society? The privacy and the confidentiality of everyone who contributes needs to be respected, and through the transparency, at the bare minimum, there needs to be the no deception factor, because when there is deception, well, it would be very difficult to justify in some cases. I know we watch documentaries where people have been filmed secretly, and they would say, well, the benefits of people being filmed secretly in those situations outweighs the risk, because they were engaged in criminal activities, and so it's for the public good, and so that justifies that deception. What justifies it is the fact that it was for the greater good. More people would benefit from from that person being exposed for being fraudulent or whatever, rather than their personal needs being respected. We need to make sure that we are complying with the laws and regulations and that data protection. And in my research, in terms of data protection, I make sure that I don't keep people's email addresses. I don't store phone numbers for the purpose of the research. And so that's why most of, in fact, all of my contributors will be from social media, where that I don't need to have I don't need to contact them by email or through personal contact information, because if I did have data, then I would need to make sure I destroy that data once they have that once I've interviewed them or had a conversation with them. So I don't need to worry about that if I'm just using my contacts from social media, because they're on social media. I know where they are, and that's one of the reasons why I create those parameters. Sometimes people say, oh, I've got someone else who may be interested in speaking with you, but if they're not on social media, I usually say, well, that's going to be too difficult, because that's going to mean that I've got to get their email address, and then I've got to get rid of their email address, and I might forget. So rather than getting engaged in that, I'd rather just create parameters around my research. Well, I know where they are. They're on social media. They're on they're on LinkedIn, or they're on Facebook, or they're on on another platform, and I know where to find them. So I personally am complying with the law and regulations, because I'm not managing that personal information. And participants always have a right to withdraw their consent, and they can they can say, well, yeah, I thought I wanted to take part in this, but now I don't. And the way I get around this is that whenever I'm having a discussion or a conversation with someone who wants to contribute to the research, I never use quotes from that person. I may remember what we've spoken about, but in my research, in my writing, I wouldn't name them. So I anonymize everyone, and through that anonymity, even if someone is no longer interested, then because their contribution is anonymous, it doesn't have a negative impact on my research, because that conversation has already taken place, and I'm not going to be naming them, and I'm not going to be quoting them. So whereas if their quote was really important, and then just before I publish something, they say, well, I don't, I want to withdraw that, and if I've already made some inroads in terms of getting that thing, then I might need to take something out, and then page numbers get messed up that way. So this is one of the reasons why I just make sure that I don't use quotes, and I don't name people in the actual writing. So once we've done all of that, then we get into our research questions. And so can you see that by the time we are ready to formulate our research questions, so much needs to have happened even before we get to this point. And we might have had like obviously that curiosity, that initial curiosity that prompted us to do the research. We had a question, but by the time we get to this point, the question will have evolved. And the research questions usually begin with open questions like who, what, when, which, where, why, and how. And the more succinct, the more concise we can make the questions, the more robust and the stronger the questions are likely to be. So let's talk a little bit about public engagement. Earlier we said that researching, the researcher is not the expert. They are co-creating knowledge with the public rather than about or for the public. And the researcher and the contributors need to have shared values. So for example, when I'm having conversations with people contributing to my research, the values of social justice and a desire to co-create social and cultural capital need to be there. There needs to be that alignment of like, why are we doing this? We're not doing this for profit. We're doing it for social justice. We're doing it not to create financial gain, but to create social and cultural gain. And there needs to be that shared understanding of like, what do we mean by citizenship? What do we mean by activism? If this research, if these ideas are going to influence, well, that's activism is implied in that. And what are we going to learn? Is it about creativity? And so the next thing is really important. Who we choose to be our public is political. that is a very political choice because, for example, I might choose my public based on their identity. Now, I may choose people who are familiar to me or people who are unfamiliar to me. That's a political choice. If I'm choosing others who are Sikhs like myself, they're familiar to me. Why am I not choosing those who are not Sikhs? Why am I not, why am I choosing to work with Sikhs and not working with, why am I excluding those who are not Sikhs? I have to rationalize that. I have to justify why I'm making that choice. Which language am I going to be doing my research in? So I'm bilingual and all of my research is in English. And the reason it's in English is because my Punjabi is not very strong. But when I did the research for Sikhs in Stafford, nearly all of the contributors were their Punjabi was the stronger language. So in that case, even though my engagement was in Punjabi, my writing was in English. So I need to recognize the political impact of that. Why am I choosing to write it in English and not both languages? And why not Punjabi and English? And in terms of education, when I did Sikhs of Stafford, my contributors were, some of them are literate and some of them are illiterate. I chose both. Whereas for Learn to Lead, I only worked with literate people. Why? Why was I only working with the literate people for Learn to Lead, whereas I worked with both literate and illiterate for Sikhs in Stafford? And so I know why I did that, but I need to be able to explain that. In terms of vocation, if I choose my public to be farmers as opposed to professionals, obviously I'm going to get different ideas, different insights, different perspectives. So for my current research about Azadi and Izzat, if I'm only working with farmers, I'm going to get very different ideas compared with if I'm working with professionals or if I'm working with a mixture of those. In terms of values, we need to make a choice of, are we going to be working with people who share our values? Well, there could be groupthink then. Like if everyone that I'm speaking to, they have similar values to my own, how do I know that I'm not victim of this groupthink where we just kind of, we see what we want to see, we perceive what we want to perceive, and we get feedback that we approve of and feedback that we don't approve of, we ignore. Why don't I work with people who have very opposing values to my own? So again, that's a political choice. And in terms of location, we need to think about, well, are we going to be working with local people or international people? All of my research currently is virtual, whereas for Sikhs of Stafford, it was all face-to-face. So there's that, that will have an impact. Is it face-to-face? Because I can't do my research face-to-face at the moment because I'm working with people in 5 different, countries. And so it's not feasible due to the travel and the distance and whatever. So, but again, that will have an impact. The virtual, doing my research in a virtual environment as opposed to a face-to-face environment will color the results that I get. And what is our sphere of influence in the public? When I did Sikhs of Stafford, I was positioned very centrally to that community, whereas the research that I'm doing currently, where I'm working with people in different countries, I'm not central. I'm not central to the contributors who are based in Canada or the US or New Zealand. I'm not central, I'm on the margins. I'm here in the UK and I've never even visited New Zealand. So I'm not positioned in that community. So our positioning will have an impact on the quality of our research and the assumptions that we make and the conclusions that we draw. most importantly with public engagement is that the communication needs to be multi-directional. It's not a unilateral communication where, you know, a researcher does the research and then they present a paper on it at a conference, and that's, they're telling you what they have found, but they're not waiting to listen and get feedback from you that will change their research. It's totally one way. It's unilateral. Whereas with the multi-directional, you research and, you know, you share what you found, and then you modify, and it's more of an iterative process between the researcher and those who are contributing. And there are risks in using public engagement, and I think, you know, when we're using public engagement, we can't kind of overlook the risks. First of all, it's very time consuming, and a lot of the time can be wasted time. So to get a handful of people who are interested in what you're doing, you may need to contact several hundred just to get a handful who are interested, because it's very difficult to know who would be interested and who wouldn't be interested. And so there's a lot of time that is taken in just simply finding the right people who may you know, who are aligned to what you're doing, and that time wasted can distract you from other priorities. There are opportunity costs in that. And so when I use social media to find, you know, who may be interested in contributing, I use generic messages, and that can be annoying to contacts because people want to have personalized messages, but when you have to contact so many people, you know, I don't have time to write a personalized message for each person, and that can be counterproductive because very often people won't respond to a generic message, and so that is a risk. You can end up annoying your contacts, where, you know, you've written to them 3 or 4 times, and then they just won't respond anymore because they feel that you haven't taken the time and trouble to write them a personal message. And there can be a lack of control over where your research will end up. So it's all well and good being transparent, but that lack of control through that transparency can lead to negative consequences that can arise along the journey. Your ideas may be distorted, they may be misused, they may be misappropriated to support counter narratives. So, for example, my current research about Azad Din Izzat, you know, people may have a particular narrative about what Izzat means, and what I'm saying could very often be distorted or misused to support a narrative that I'm not endorsing myself. And when knowledge has been co-created through conversations, through discussions, through conferences. So, you know, there may be a dozen people on a panel discussion in a conference. How do we know where the idea originated from? Because somebody may have asked a very good question that led to a very good insight. So who owns that? Is it the person who asked the question, who triggered, who was the catalyst for the idea, or is it the person who put forward an idea, or is it another person who developed the idea? So those are issues that, you know, again, like with the transparency, with, like, you know, there can be a lot of honor and nobility in being transparent, but then there could be a competition in terms of, well, some people may want to use those ideas in a commercial way for profit, whereas your intention may have been to use those ideas for public value. But that's where that conflict can arise. It's like if somebody wants to commercialize what you've done, but that was not your intention, well, do they still have the right to commercialize it because they did participate, they did contribute? So, you know, even though your agenda is social good, their agenda was not entirely social good. It might have been social good when they contributed, but later on, you know, 5 years down the line, they might want to use that for a commercial benefit. And so who has the right to control something which has been co-created, which, you know, more than one person has contributed to, and who, you know, who has the ultimate right? So those are things to consider. There can be a loss of reputation and loss of self-confidence, because again, with that transparency with the public, very often we don't know exactly where that person is coming from in terms of their ideas and their opinions, because they're not somebody who is part of your friendship circle. And, you know, you might invite them to a conference and they say something which is very shocking to you as well as to everybody else, and because you've invited them, it will lead to a loss of reputation and a loss of your self-confidence, because you took that risk and, you know, it didn't go the way you wanted it to go. So those are things that we need to be aware of and make sure that we are resilient enough to that. We're resilient to the negative feedback that we can receive, and loss of jobs, careers, friendships, those things all have happened. People have lost their jobs because of something they've said off the cuff in a conversation, and it was on social media. You know, there are numerous cases of people losing their jobs or their careers being undermined and friendships being lost. So using public engagement isn't all kind of like, oh, that's a wonderful way to do research. We do need to take into consideration the fact that there are, you know, numerous risks that we are taking, and we need to make sure that we are, you know, we're able to defend ourselves with the resilience to be able to take into account that the negative feedback, we will, you know, with that honesty, with that, you know, standing in that ground of like speaking truth to power, we need to make sure that we're not attacking, that we're speaking truth to power in a manner that is more defensive rather than attacking, you know. So if we stand in that ground, we need to kind of like make sure that that ground is strong enough to be able to cope with the criticism or the external attacks on what we are doing. So let's look at the data collection then for those three aspects: autoethnography, public engagement, and published work. For autoethnography, it can be numerous sources of data, like our journals, our diaries, photographs, we have videos, books, articles, letters, emails that we've sent. And again, all of these, the data, where are we getting the data source for what we're writing about in our autoethnography? And the reason this data source is important is that this will provide us with that reflection where we know we're not simply ranting about something. We're, you know, that what we have, we're removed enough from that thing that we've had time to reflect on it, you know, and we've got evidence to support what we are saying. So this creates that kind of logical coherence in, you know, the ideas that we're presenting based on our lived experience. And the public engagement, that can, the data for that can come from our conversations, discussions, our stories, even experiences where we have observed and we've been immersed in those particular experiences. So for the published work, the data that we get from that, for that will be from experts, consultants, other authors, documents that we've looked at, multimedia, social media. So there's a wide array of our data, and I think with technology, we have the ability to use, you know, not only written material, we can use electronic, we can use verbal, we can use, you know, oral evidence as well. The conversations don't necessarily have to be recorded. It could be conversations that we've overheard on the bus. You know, that can be part of that public engagement as well. It's not limited to something which is tangible and written down. So with the data analysis, so with my own work, I focus mainly on looking for themes, patterns, the discourse, what is the narrative, what are the stories and what are the gaps, and above all, what is the value in that analysis, what's new, what are the insights, what are the frameworks that I can create, or the models that I can formulate, what are the concepts that are arising from that data. And what I said earlier about self-publishing, just to end on that as well now, is that self-publishing allows us to influence and to impact by being articulate, honest, and sincere. And those three words, being articulate, being honest or truthful, and being sincere, they come from the philosopher Habermas, where he talks about communicative action as a theory. And that those three elements, if we are communicating in a way that is speaking the truth with sincerity and being articulate, there is influence in that. And I believe that in order to speak in that way, we do need to have the courage, we do need to have the confidence, we need to be compassionate. When we're speaking truth to power, we have to do it with compassion, so that we're defending rather than attacking, and we do need to be creative. And self-publishing gives us, or it can provide us with empowerment and emancipation, where we are accountable, responsible, we have ownership of the content and also the consequences of anything that we say. We have the freedom to bypass the gatekeepers, we're speaking truth to power, and this existence of a document or record exerts power. This is very, very important, because once we write something down, based on our lived experience, the existence of that does exert power. And again, let's refer back to the post office scandal and the sub postmasters. 20 years down, some of them have been challenging what happened to them for 20 years. And, and there was an email received by one of these sub postmasters, inviting him to visit, the Fujitsu Horizon office. And without the existence of that email, there was no proof that that person had ever visited the Horizon offices. There was no proof. And so the fact that that email had been received exerts power. There's evidence. So once we write something down, whether it's in our journal, whether it's on a blog, whether it's a comment on social media, that exerts power. We're publishing once we do that. For example, we see somebody's message on LinkedIn and we click like. The fact that we've clicked like, we have published our opinion, so, and there's power in that, because that, the fact that you clicked the like button and you published, you made your opinion public, can be used for you or it can be used against you. There are numerous cases where people have been criticized or condemned for liking a post which was controversial, and so every time that we do that, every time we make our opinions public, we are exerting power, either supporting or undermining, and that power can be used for us or it can be used against us. And so this is the other thing about the self-publishing. It's like, I always talk about this because we need to recognize our responsibility and our accountability for the consequences of making our thoughts public. Yeah, so basically that is APS, the autoethnography, public engagement and self-publishing approach that I use, that I have used for writing my books, such as Seeks of Stafford and Learn to Lead and Finding the One in a Million. I used a similar approach for that as well, and I'm currently using the same approach to write my book about Azad the Izzat and the concept of home, because those concepts, the reason I'm researching it is because I don't know the answer to many of the questions that I have about it, and I can't find other people who know the answer. So therefore, it's something worth researching, because the answers are not obvious. Okay, so do you have any questions? Let me just stop the recording.